I'll go ahead and introduce Eric and say a couple of quick thank yous before we kick things off. First of all, thank you to all of you for joining us. I want to thank everybody for supporting North Branch Nature Center and the work that we do. Our ability to do this webinar series and a lot of the other online work that we're doing right now is made possible by your contributions to us and your support of our North Branch Resiliency Fund. So thank you very much for all that have contributed to that. And if you have been finding our content valuable, please, we encourage you, if you are able to go ahead and donate to that. And if you're not able to, that is totally fine too. We're happy to have you. You can also help us out just by, things like Facebook likes and shares and all that social media stuff does go a long way in this virtual age. So feel free to support us that way. Eric has been working with the Vermont Alliance for Half Earth for the last year now, putting together stories about how people interact with the biodiversity in our own landscape. And he's been doing this in a very kind of different style than what you might find in other academic settings. Eric's a graduate student currently, at least for another few days, is a student in graduate student in the UVM Field Naturalist program. And we'll be, I think Eric said that this presentation here marks one of the final project-related components of the whole master. So let's make sure to give Eric a big congratulations on wrapping up his master's here in a moment. Eric joins us from, well, originally from Wisconsin, got his bachelor's from Williams College in 2014. Has been in the field naturalist program for the last couple of years, and his work focuses on everything from ecological inventory, geospatial analysis, habitat restoration, conservation, and really just big picture looking at people's, how people relate to the natural world. So Eric, thank you very much for joining us. I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen and you can go ahead and start, and we're off.
Okay. Let's see here.
Looks good.
All right. Well, hi. Does that look good? Okay, good.
Yeah, looks great.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here and listening to me. I hope you learned something. So my presentation today is called A Shared Life, People and Biodiversity in Vermont. And you're about to find out why. So times are obviously different this year. This time last year, I was in the woods with a lot of my classmates and faculty from the plant biology department where the field naturalist program is housed. And we were out in the woods learning about spring ephemeral flowers, and I had seen a trillium flower growing right next to a bloodroot flower. And so I decided to play a little trick where I pushed the bloodroot flower on top of the trillium flower, and I took a picture and I asked people to help me ID this new unknown plant, and got a lot of amusing but inaccurate answers. Unfortunately, I can't be joking around with my friends and classmates in the woods this year. And instead I've found myself spending a lot more time paying attention in nature, which some of you may find hard to believe because I already spend a lot of time paying attention in nature. But for the first time this year, I've really paid attention to birds. I've been listening to birds and following them. And just yesterday, I learned a new one, the white-crowned sparrow. I've also been learning a lot of new insects and trees. This picture here, this is a hackberry tree here in Burlington. And it was a tree I didn't know until this spring, and I decided to start learning flower buds or leaf buds. And the little bug inside is also a bug I never knew. It's actually the larva of a firefly, all those insects that everybody knows. And after I saw this firefly larva and learned what it is, I went back this morning, and I found 5 other firefly larvae in this tree. And then I started looking with my girlfriend. We started looking at every tree on the street, and almost every tree had either firefly larvae or adults crawling around in the bark. And it was amazing. I never knew that happened. I've also spent a lot of time foraging for nettles, and that turns your eye into a new level of alertness when you're out in the woods, looking for things that you might want to eat, tasty things like that. I've also noticed a lot of other people doing the same things. Yesterday, I saw two women carrying huge bags of metals down in the Intervale. A lot of other people learning insects and that sort of thing. Um, it says that my internet connection is bad, so if people can't hear me, maybe Sean could say something.
Yep, I can hear you fine. Your video is a little bit choppy, but I can hear you just fine.
Okay, well then I'll keep going. And so it struck me this year that I've been sort of amazed at, I can't spend as much time with friends, but that sense of friendship and companionship and community has really kind of mapped onto the natural world instead this year. I remember when I first learned plants in college, it seemed like a new dimension of reality opened up to me, where I started seeing individual creatures and organisms and patterns instead of just scenery of nature. And it's this spring that's happening to me again, and I hope that keeps happening to me my whole life. This newfound focus, though, has also brought into sharp focus the destruction that people are having on the natural world. And recently, scientists have gotten really good at describing and quantifying just how destructive people are. We found out that bird populations in the US and Canada have fallen by 30% since 1970, which is about 3 billion birds, which is a lot. The insects that those birds depend upon are also in decline. 40% of insect species around the world are in decline, and a third of all insect species are facing extinction. And what I found extremely shocking was even in protected areas, insects are in decline. So places that people aren't cutting down trees or plowing or developing, you would think would be safe for insects, but even in places like that, this study was done in Germany, and they found over the past 30 years that flying insects have declined by 76%. You know, what's another 27 years going to bring? Other taxa, other types of organisms are also experiencing these declines. I like to think that maybe humanity lives embedded within a natural world, but the statistic here just kind of evaporates that fantasy. Only 4% of mammals on Earth are wild. The 96% of mammals on Earth are either humans or are domesticated animals. And since the onset of civilization, all life on Earth has decreased by 50%. So all the life that we know of in the universe and that we'll probably ever see has been declined by half since we've started moving about the Earth. And all this leads to sort of the grandmother report of all of them. Across the globe, there's a group called the IPBES, and they're a UN-sponsored group of scientists, and they're tasked with understanding the state of biodiversity across the world. And they looked at 15,000 studies recently, and have since told us that 1 million species across the Earth are facing extinction, many within the next few decades. And people we've done a pretty good job at conserving nature so far. We've built national parks, and we've made wildlife reserves in Africa and in South America and on all that sort of thing. But these acts have not been enough. And if we continue going on as business as usual, same style of conservation, same sort of economic and international policies, we're going to face these biodiversity crisis. We're going to lose these species. And it's not unless we go through transformative change across economic, social, and political and technological factors. Unless we do that, we're not going to save biodiversity on the planet. And this kind of gets at the heart of why I'm in the Field Naturalist program. I've always cared about biodiversity and global biodiversity, and kind of always understood that it was declining, but I never knew what I could do about it. I felt sort of helpless and thought that it was a problem somebody else was going to have to solve, until I decided that that I didn't want to keep feeling helpless, and I wanted to go to graduate school and learn about what I might be able to do. And I don't have all the answers, obviously, but I do feel a little less helpless now, 2 years later. So if we're going to talk about biodiversity loss, it's important to talk about why that matters. What is the value of nature? Why does biodiversity loss matter? And traditionally, for the past 100 years, there have been two arguments. Nature is either valuable in its own right, it has nothing to do with humans, or nature is valuable because it provides things for humans, things like resources, timber, also clean water and oxygen. And both those arguments are really compelling. I feel compelled by both of them strongly. But as we know from the last slide from the IPBES study, these values framings are failing, because if we keep following them as we have been, we're going to lose a million species, or at least a lot of species. So recently, social scientists and environmental scientists have thought, why are these frameworks failing? And they come up with a third way of thinking about the reason that the natural world is valuable to us. And they call them relational values. And relational values are the preferences, principles, and virtues associated with relationships. And this is sort of a complicated and esoteric description. It doesn't really make much sense. But I think the best way to explain it is that relational values are non-substitutable. And it makes sense. We feel this way sort of inherently about human relationships all the time. If you had, for example, if you had a brother that you loved, for some of us, that's easy to imagine. Imagine if you had a brother that you loved and somebody from the government came and they said, we have to take your brother away and he's going to move somewhere else and you'll never be able to see him again, but he'll be okay. But we're going to give you a new brother who's just as kind and thoughtful, and he'll go home for Christmas with you and all that sort of thing. So it'll be okay. If that happened to me, I would not accept that. You can't replace my brother like that. We grew up together. We have all these childhood memories and struggles and have grown together as adults, and you can't just replace a person like that. And a lot of people feel the same way about nature. Relational values are pretty new. People haven't explored them too much and how they're expressed, but recently people did a study down in Colombia and they asked people, why is this river important to you? And they asked rural people and urban people, and 96% of the respondents mentioned relational values. And 40% of respondents mentioned instrumental values or intrinsic values, and only 2% of respondents mentioned instrumental values. And yet, intrinsic and instrumental are the only two ways that many governments and decision makers think about the value of nature. So clearly, if we only think about nature in these limited ways, we're going to miss some of the value when we try to conserve nature. And also, if we try to conserve nature in local places and we don't consider the true reasons that people value nature, we're going to be imposing conservation onto people instead of conserving with them, and just cause friction and strife and unjust outcomes. So back to biodiversity conservation. There's a famous scientist named E.O. Wilson, and he's sort of the father of biodiversity, a lot of people say. And he tells us, and this is hopeful, finally, this is something hopeful, that we can save biodiversity on Earth. But if we want to do it, we have to designate and devote half the Earth's surface to nature in some way. And this is because we know this because there's a phenomenon with islands where as islands get smaller, they're able to support fewer and fewer species. And also as they are further away from the mainland, they also support fewer species. And this is because on small islands, populations of plants and animals are smaller. And so with the random weather events or droughts or something like that, it's a lot more likely that a species is going to go extinct. And then it's going to be hard for that species to recolonize the islands. So we're trying to get to 50%, and right now people are talking about goals of 30% by 2030 and 50% by 2050. And right now we're at 15% and failing at reaching those targets, but I think we can get there. So of course that theory was derived from looking at islands, but it also applies to fragments of habitat. Over spring break, I was flying from Montreal to Vancouver, Canada, with my girlfriend because we're going to move there in the fall when she starts her graduate program. And when I was looking out the plane window, and I noticed that we're flying over my childhood home in Appleton, Wisconsin, which is just wild. But looking at this out of the plane window, you can see photons that bounced off of off of my house in Appleton. And all the white areas in this picture are farm fields covered in snow, and all the dark areas are forests, little woodlots that are in the back of people's farm fields. And these fragments, it adds up to a large percent of the area, maybe, I don't know, 20% or something like that. But individually, they're so small that they can't support breeding populations of a lot of different species. So if you were a box turtle, you wouldn't be able to find a mate in one of these areas. Maybe you could only support a few box turtles. And so box turtles will go extinct in a little patch of habitat, and then they won't be able to recolonize that habitat. And so even though there's a lot of forest in this picture, you still can't support box turtles. And that's the basic issue behind habitat fragmentation. And this is what a lot of the world looks like right now. And national parks and reserves are a good thing, but even those are small islands compared to their original ecosystems that they represented. And on their own, they're not going to be able to conserve all the biodiversity on our planet. A couple of years ago, there was a group from Vermont, a group of citizens, a couple professors, a couple business owners, teachers, who went down to New York City and heard E.O. Wilson talk about his half-Earth idea. And they were inspired, and they thought, well, we should go back to Vermont and try to spread the message of half-Earth here in Vermont and try to accelerate biodiversity conservation here. And I'm lucky enough to have them as my project sponsors. And when I had the opportunity to work with them, I was extremely excited, because this is the problem that I felt so overwhelmed by before I started graduate school, but I didn't know anybody who was working on it, at least in the full seriousness that this issue deserves. And so I started working with them, and my role has been to help them in this mission. And it started out as a pretty vague objective. We had some ideas of what I should do, but we didn't have a full picture. And so I started out my project a year ago by talking to various conservation leaders throughout Vermont. I talked with Liz Thompson at the Vermont Land Trust, and Bob Zano and Eric Sorensen at the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. And I asked them, so what is the most important thing right now for accelerating biodiversity conservation in Vermont? And that's a big general question, but I decided to ask it and just to see what the response would be. And I learned that the Vermont Fish and Wildlife has already put a lot of effort into answering the question that the Vermont half-Earth is trying to answer as well, which is, if we want to conserve most of the species in Vermont, which are the most important places? And so Vermont Fish and Wildlife's mission is actually part of their mission is to conserve all the species of plants and animals in Vermont into the future. And they asked themselves, if we want to do that, how do we do it? And they came up with what's called Vermont Conservation Design. And this is an amazing plan that they put together in just the past few years. And it answers the crucial question of half-Earth, which is, which half do we protect? And so they knew that if we wanted to conserve all the species in Vermont, there's about 20,000 or more species of plants and animals and fungi and other things in Vermont. And it would be impossible to create conservation plans or management plans for every single one. So instead, they followed what's called the coarse filter approach to conservation, which the idea behind that is you find the landscape and habitat features that represent the needs of most of the species in an area on the landscape. And if you conserve those, you're going to protect most of the species, and then a few species will fall through the cracks, and then you create detailed management plans for those species. And so if you look at the map, the green areas are what are called highest priority interior forest blocks. And these are large chunks of forest, and they are necessary for some species in their own right. Like black bear and moose can't survive unless they have large tracts of forest. But by protecting those areas, you also protect other species which have a lot less stringent needs, all the sort of forest generalist species. But that's not going to protect everything. And so the purple areas are called landscape diversity blocks. And these are areas that have rare natural communities or maybe unique soils and bedrocks, and they support their own unique suites of species. And so if we protect those, we're going to capture another chunk of the species in Vermont. And then this map also designates the wetlands and the rivers that are important for protecting ecosystem function. throughout Vermont. And then the last piece is the orange chunks, which are called connectivity blocks. And these are sort of the glue that holds the whole Vermont conservation design together. So if you want to conserve species, you also have to conserve genetic diversity. And so plants and animals have to be able to move throughout the landscape and find new breeding partners that are outside of their home. But also importantly, when the climate changes, plants and animals are going to have to shift their ranges to find new suitable habitat. It's going to get warmer, so a lot of species are going to have to move north. But if their paths to new suitable habitat are blocked by roads or development, then they're going to die in place before they can colonize a new place, and we'll lose that species in Vermont. So this designates, Vermont conservation design designates all the parts of Vermont that are necessary for our biodiversity, but it also provides management guidelines at each of those points. And so you can go anywhere in Vermont, there's an online tool, and you can look and see how your land or how that land contributes to biodiversity and ecosystem function. And then you can also look up management guidelines. So if you want to conserve biodiversity and ecosystem function, there's guidelines. And so maybe in a large forest, you can log, as long as you don't build new roads and cause further fragmentation, and you can hunt and that sort of thing. But if you were to build a house in the middle of a connectivity corridor, you would compromise the integrity of Vermont's biodiversity. And it goes into a lot more detail on that, but that's the general idea. So this is fantastic. It answers the big question of, if we want to conserve biodiversity, how do we do it? But I learned that though this tool is new and great, not many people know about it or use about it yet. And so it seemed like the most important thing I could do is try to engage more people with Vermont conservation design, and teach them how it's used and why it's useful. And so going forward with this plan, I had the central idea that people are motivated by what they feel more than by what they know, but that knowledge is critical for effective action. And what I mean by that is there's already guides for Vermont conservation design, but they're long and they're technical, and not many people are motivated to read them on their own. So I had to find a way to engage people and sneak in little bits of conservation information so that they would be motivated to learn them on their own. And so what I decided to do was create a collection of stories that were featuring different people throughout Vermont and their relationship with the land. The idea was that that people are a lot more interested in humans and human relationships, and if I could get engaging stories and make them visually engaging, people would be interested and learn about biodiversity that way. And I designed these stories to share conservation concepts and inspire people to act, and then also give them the tools to act effectively. To make these stories, I interviewed a bunch of folks throughout the Winooski watershed, and as a group, we decided to just focus on one watershed because we wanted to constrain ourselves. It's hard if you're trying to find people all over the state, and it's a little easier if you constrain yourselves, but also to show that even small places and local places have a lot of beauty and important relationships, and that conservation is something that needs to happen at home, not somewhere else, somewhere exotic. And so to find people, I reached out to local conservation organizations and farming organizations and foresters and 2 different Abenaki communities. And then I ended up getting 16 people to interview. Together with my research advisor, we designed a set of questions, a standardized set of interview questions that was designed so that I could use it for relational values research, which I'm going to continue doing with my advisor, but I'm not going to talk about much in this talk. But I also designed the questions to kind of get at the heart of why people care about nature and biodiversity, because I suspect that a lot of us hold within us an emotional connection to nature, but we don't talk about it very much. And I wanted to draw that out because I thought it would make for better stories and more important stories. So I asked questions. I asked people to take me to places that were particularly meaningful to them, because I thought that they would produce better conversation and better interviews. And I asked people questions like, how would you describe your relationship to the land here? And to the degree that you care about the other organisms on Earth, could you explain to me why? What would you like me or other people to understand about this place? And if the land could talk, what do you think it would say? I asked a whole bunch of other questions too. I thought these questions were fun because, well, a lot of people kind of stared back at me when I asked them because they're not very normal questions, but then they always gave interesting answers after I waited for them to gather their thoughts. After the interviews, I would go around and photograph all the different places and things that people showed me, and also other things that I thought were beautiful or I thought would be important to include in the stories. So I learned a lot of things from these interviews, but one of the main things that I learned is that people who do the most to protect biodiversity on their land have two things in common. Everybody had an explicit relationship with nature, which is kind of obvious maybe, but it's also insightful, illuminating. There was a person who I interviewed, and he grew up a dairy farmer on this property in Richmond, Vermont. And he had to quit dairy farming because he couldn't make money doing it. And I asked him, what does your relationship with the other organisms on Earth look like? And he looked back at me like I was speaking another language. But after a while, he started talking about white-tailed deer. And it turns out that he loves white-tailed deer more than almost anything else on the Earth. He thinks they're just graceful and inspiring, and he admires the way they can survive through harsh conditions all throughout the winter. And so this person who loves deer so much, he had to stop farming because he didn't have enough money. He didn't make enough money, and he subdivided part of his land and used that money to conserve the rest of it. Another thing I learned is that people who protect land or protect biodiversity on their land have to actually own land to do that protection. And that's also obvious, but also important because in Vermont, about 80% of the land is owned privately. And so people who don't own land, people who rent, rely on landowners to protect land, protect biodiversity, and also rely on the state government. Something that I thought was interesting about that is that a healthy ecosystem is really the birthright of all of us, but we don't have equal power to protect it. And so I think we need to think as a society and as a government that it's important to protect this public right and these public values. Last year I went to hunter safety because I wanted to start deer hunting, and I learned that poaching is illegal because all wildlife in Vermont are owned publicly by the state and by the people of Vermont. And so poaching is stealing from the citizens, is how they described it. And I thought that was interesting. I thought maybe that could apply to water and pollinators and clean air and all these other things that we get from nature that are really public goods, but are controlled a lot of times by private decision makers. So each of these stories display different relationships to the environment along with relevant conservation concepts. Some of these relational concepts were, some people talked about how the importance of nature to childhood, how important it is to them to be raising their children in a place that has a healthy and interesting environment. Other people talked about how the loss of nature is a loss of heritage. If you grow up somewhere and your family has always hunted there and you learned how to hunt there, and then it gets cut down and you can't hunt there anymore, you've lost something. You've lost part of your connection to your family and your ancestors and your community. Other people talked about how management and actually logging can be an act of care for the land. And we sometimes think about forestry as just cutting down trees and hurting the land, but in some cases it's actually rehabilitating parts of the land that have been hurt by past human use. And this is important to many of the people that I talked about. And also a lot of people I talked about had a strong sense of partnership or companionship with the natural world. And others, they found community with nature, but more so they found community with other people by being in nature. And it's in spending time with other people in healthy ecosystems that they built their relationships with these other people. And then of course, I talked about conservation concepts as well, like the importance of wetlands and how climate change and biodiversity loss are connected. The importance of balancing both reserves and managed areas, because we do have to extract resources. We do have to build houses and heat our homes and that sort of thing. But we can do that. We can extract resources in a way that is consistent with protecting biodiversity, but we also do need reserves in places that can't handle resource extraction. I also talked about some of the basic concepts of biodiversity conservation. Pretty much, if you want to conserve a diversity of life of different types of plants and animals, what you have to do is conserve a diversity of habitats, because that's what the animals and plants rely upon. I also talked about practical things like conservation easements and different policies throughout the state, like current use. So I wrote all the stories about people and their personal relationships, and then I wrote one final story that wasn't really about any people in particular. It was my attempt to bring all these different concepts together in one place and describe biodiversity at all different scales, and also provide the tools to protect biodiversity at a bunch of different scales. And I organized it around two things. One, that I think the foundation of biodiversity protection is building personal relationships with nature. And I think this is something that I saw in all my participants, but also personal relationships are the things that are going to give us the energy to continue wanting to learn what the natural world needs to be healthy and what biodiversity needs. And it's going to give us the energy to continue to want to try to protect biodiversity. And if we're going to make transformational change across the earth to protect biodiversity, we're going to need that energy that comes from personal relationships. We also just know that strong relationships are the foundation of good life for us. And it's been shown in studies that people who have a stronger connection to nature have a higher sense of well-being. So I think these personal relationships, you know, they're a gift to biodiversity, but they're also a gift to us and a gift to the other people that we develop these relationships with. And then the other organizational concept that I used in this story was the half Earth at every scale. And by this, I mean, well, during the early days of the Vermont Alliance for Half Earth, we started talking about, you know, how can we get people to conserve biodiversity in the yard? Let's call it half yard. Let's try to get people to consider rewilding half the yard, planting native plants in half the yard. And let's start talking about it at the town scale, or maybe a half watershed, half state. And so if we want to get to half of the land protected across the earth, we're going to have to protect nature and biodiversity at all these different scales and local scales. And so at the half yard, I talked about how the foundation of food webs is native plants a lot of the time, because native plants tend to support more insects, and insects are what birds and even bears eat. I think black bears, about 25% of their diet is insects. So even in our yards, we can do a lot to strengthen food webs and strengthen biodiversity. Here in Vermont, the town scale is one of the most powerful scales that we can protect biodiversity at. Vermont conservation design can be used to create zoning bylaws and other things like that. And in Vermont, at least, zoning is set up by citizens. And so people who are interested can have a lot of influence over the integrity of our ecosystem in Vermont at the town scale. Of course, I also talked about things that need to happen at the state scale. We need more funding and other things like that. And I talked about what needs to happen at the global scale and the national scale, because if we don't hold our politicians accountable, if we continue to have the same economic policies and the same international policies and same financial policies, we're not gonna be able to save biodiversity on this planet. We're gonna lose those million species. So why are these stories important, and how are they going to be used? I think the most important thing about these stories is that I tried to link emotional engagement with the tools to act effectively, to try to undermine the helplessness that I had felt earlier. And I think that a lot of people feel that stops them from conserving biodiversity. It's like, sure, yes, I care, but I don't know what I can do about it. So I tried to address that. And then I also designed these so that they can be teaching tools for conservation organizations and schools. And the Vermont Alliance works with a lot of teachers. I also taught in classrooms this year. And I've talked to teachers who are very interested in using these stories as teaching tools in their classrooms. I just published these stories about 3 weeks ago, and they've been featured by the North Branch Nature Center and also the Vermont Natural Resources Council. And already there's been about 1,000 views at each of the stories. And I've also been talking to local and national organizations like the Vermont Land Trust and Vermont Fish and Wildlife and Northeast Wilderness Trust and the Forest Stewards Guild and the E.O. Wilson Foundation. And all of these organizations have shown interest, and we're in talks about when and how we're going to publish these in the future. So I think they're going to continue to have an impact and continue to be used. Going forward, I'm going to continue to do relational values analysis with my advisor. I'm going to graduate, but we're going to keep working together, and I'm hoping to publish a paper because relational values are a fairly new concept. And so they're incorporated into international policy, but people don't really know how they're expressed. And so my interviews were designed specifically to understand how people express them. And I'm also looking at the relationship between relational values and empathy, which I think will be strong. So these are all my references. And I've got a lot of people to thank, especially my sponsors, the Vermont Alliance for Half-Earth, all my academic advisors, my research participants, and a lot of other people who have helped me along the way. Okay, thank you. People can feel free to ask me questions if they would like.
Thanks, Eric. Feel free to throw your questions in the chat bar. And I actually think that we are a group that is appropriately sized, that if you are so bold as to unmute yourself and ask a question that way, and then remute yourself, that's totally acceptable too. But while you're gathering your thoughts over there on your end, I'll just ask you a couple of questions, Eric. So
Yeah.
Having read a couple of these stories, if folks haven't read these stories yet, it's just beautiful writing, fantastic photography, and you know, really you feel as an audience member that you're building a really deep connection with the people in the story. Eric, I'm wondering if you could share another example, like you're with these people on a piece of land that they care incredibly deeply about, and they're kind of letting you into their personal, it's kind of like them letting you into their home, into their, you know, into their bedroom in a way, right? And I'm wondering if you can share any you know, a story or two of just something really powerful that that somebody said, you know, while you're out there in the woods with them, or just something that struck you.
Yeah, I was speaking with Ethan Tapper, and he's a local county forester. And by the end, he was just almost shouting about how much he cared about these woods and how good they made him feel to take care of. And he felt like it was just an absurd concept to him that he owned the land, and that he was somehow responsible for, you know, the rocks and the bedrock and all the forests, and how that was so meaningful for him in his life. Another story that struck me was, there's a woman, and she was one of the people who I talked to who's from an Abenaki community, and she had grown up in Colchester, which is near the mouth of the Winooski River, and she grew up speaking Abenaki with her family and still carrying out traditions despite a lot of pressure otherwise. But pretty soon her parents split up, and she started going to school, and she was pressured by society to stop speaking Abenaki, and she was able to pass as a white person. And so she started just living as a white person and let go of all of her heritage. And then by the time she got older, her father died, and she had forgotten the language, and she had gone back to her childhood home, and this place where she had grown up gathering herbs and other things with her family was just paved over and turned into development. And it was really striking how much of a parallel there was between that sense of loss of heritage and the loss of the natural world that is kind of, we're stealing the heritage from future generations if we don't do enough to conserve these places. that hit me a lot.
I think your point is so important about how the way in which we, rally the troops or get people on the bandwagon of conservation locally and globally is around building connections with the natural world and those relational values. I'm just wondering if you thought about other ways to scale this up to other places, other countries, other demographics, other Vermont is an interesting laboratory for practicing these sorts of conservation ideas. But I'm wondering if you thought about how these like these stories, for instance, as one method of engagement, or other methods can work in other places, other scales, other people who live very different lives than us.
Well, I think something that would be really interesting is kind of going to the local places and making them feel special by highlighting the stories that are there. I think a lot of times we feel that our homes are just normal and special things are somewhere else. And I think it would be great to continue doing this storytelling exercise in other places. I think also I went back to Wisconsin this winter and I asked about, do you have a conservation plan? And Wisconsin doesn't have anything like Vermont conservation design. And that's something that I'm really interested in trying to implement in other places, is doing an inventory of the different habitats and trying to come up with a plan there as well. I think Vermont is really cool because the Fish and Wildlife already embodies a lot of these relational values, even though it's a new concept and not a concept that they talk about, but they always talk about how, Vermont wouldn't be Vermont without these places. And what makes Vermont the place we love is that it has large forests and clean rivers and that sort of thing. And I think that sort of language can be taken other places. And I think also there's a lot of international sort of money for biodiversity projects that are going on, where people are trying to pay communities in other countries to take care of biodiversity. And I think in those places, it'll be crucial to ask the people that live there, what's your relationship like with the natural world, and why do you value it? And how can we design conservation programs that enhance those values instead of undermine them?
A few other questions coming in. One quick one from Louise is, where can we find a link to your presentation? And it's not a PowerPoint, it's actually a story map, which is a really cool format. Would you, maybe you already sent me the link to your story map that you're using to present, but when I post the recording of this webinar, I'll put up next to it a link to your presentation, if that's all right.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah, so if you want to send me that at some point, in case I've lost it, that would be great. Katie's asking, have you noticed a difference in types of relational values among age groups, children's, teens, young adults versus seniors, etc.?
Yeah. Well, I only interviewed 16 people and none of them were younger than 28. And so I don't have a perfect representation, but I think the people I spoke to, as they got older, there's a lot more concern for future generations and for the role that land has on children and the people that are inheriting the earth from us. And then conversely, I interviewed 2 people who either had young children or were about to have young children, and to them, taking care of the land specifically for their children was really important to them, which was cool. Yeah.
And then the question, is there a plan here in Vermont to actually implement the Vermont conservation design, or another way to phrase that would be, how are people currently implementing that?
Yeah. Well, there's a program by Vermont Fish and Wildlife. I forget what it's called exactly. It's maybe community conservation something, where they will go around to different towns and help them develop management plans and zoning plans and use Vermont conservation design as a tool. But currently it's not a regulatory tool. It's purely an informational tool. If you want to protect biodiversity, this tells you how to do it and where to do it. And I think that's one of most important challenges going forward is figuring out how to use this more. But I think it can definitely be an important tool to private decision makers without any sort of framework.
And I'd also just add that Fish and Wildlife has a couple of folks on staff, a couple of actually field naturalist alumni as well, who actually work directly, whose job it is to work directly with conservation commissions and conservation boards to bridge that gap between here's Vermont conservation design, and then here's your town's zoning laws or town plan or things like that, and how do those come together?
Isn't that the community wildlife program, maybe something like that?
Couple of questions. Don't know if you know the answer. Has Fish and Wildlife estimated the funding required to implement such a plan?
You know, I don't think they have, and that's complicated because the plan isn't like you have enough money, you can just buy all the easements. It's in a lot of cases convincing landowners that it's important to try to conserve these values on their land. I think one of the big constraints right now is that to conserve your land, it often costs money. Unless you have a really stellar property where land trusts and the government are willing to pay for it, you usually have to pay, at least in part, for your conservation easement. And I don't think anybody's estimated how much it would cost to just buy conservation easements on every single property, but more funding allocated to that is definitely really important right now.
Another really good question from Matthew here. How do we advance a half Vermont plan without making a sacrifice zone of the other half? What livelihoods are compatible within the conserved half, and what are the priorities in the non-conserved zone to avoid negative spillover?
Oh yeah, that's a great question.
I expect you to perfectly have this problem totally solved, Eric.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is that it is kind of a gradation between zones. It's not like a conserved half and a sacrifice zone. Within the conserved half, I think biodiversity is the priority. And so we really want to try to limit activities that undermine biodiversity. But like I was saying, you know, hunting can happen in almost any place in Vermont, and it's not going to hurt biodiversity as long as it's following rules and regulations set by the state. And sustainable forestry can happen in almost all these zones. We have to set aside some areas. I think the state said it has a goal for 10% old growth forest in the future across the state. And so there's going to have to be some planning of where we shouldn't log, but a lot of areas are really open to sustainable forestry and continuing to contribute to our economy that way. And then conversely, in places where people do live and farm, one thing that's going to be really important is putting habitat buffers along streams and wetlands. And so even where we have houses, we need to protect biodiversity by not disrupting riparian zones, because they're really important for habitat or animal migration, and they're also important for water quality. And they're also just places that house a lot of biodiversity. And so that's one way of sort of integrating the two halves. But then I think also where people live, even in the suburbs or in urban areas, the plants that we plant are so important because they can either be plants that contribute to the ecosystem or contribute nothing. And a lot of times native plants host a whole range of specialist insects that without native plants would just be extinct or not present. And we can host those sorts of organisms in places where we live, and then these in turn support bird populations and that sort of thing. And I think ideally the places that we live would be permeable to nature and sort of flow into it rather than just being delineations with nothing inside but lawn and concrete.
If anybody else has any additional questions, now is the time to ask. Eric, if you want to share your email address with us just right here, if anyone wants to get in touch with you about this, that would be great.
Yeah, so my email address is Eric J. Hagen, EricJHagen 1 @gmail.com.
Well, Eric, thank you very much for sharing this with us. It's really something to be in a state where we have a lot of smart folks working together across in such an interdisciplinary way to come up with a blueprint for moving forward into the future of conservation here. And I just want to thank you for helping to paint a picture of that. I think this great discussion here is would be a good reason to invite a couple more presentations about Vermont conservation design overall and how that's being used, and I'd love to expand on this some more. So, so thanks, Eric, for educating us, entertaining us, and congratulations on
thank you
on graduation.
Yeah, and thanks for hosting me here.
All right, well, thank you, everybody. Have a great night and a great weekend.